everyone. I don't know about you, but I love that music that our programming director Michelle Anger chose for our PowerPoint. It was really, really lively and very good for us to get started on our great decisions discussion that's going to talk about a kind of difficult topic, pandemic preparedness. We've all been there. We went through all of it, and what have we learned? And that's what I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss today. And I am just delighted that we will have with us an expert, Dr. Jose de Arimatea da Cruz. And I'm going to give you a little bit more about Dr. de Cruz's bio and his expertise and all of that. But suffice it to say that we're in for a very enlightening discussion. And you know how it goes. And also, I want to apologize. Were unable to get expert speakers so that we could have our discussion on the High Seas Treaty. But I'm hoping to reschedule that. We now have Dr. Kirsten Bookmiller from Millersville, who will be able to lead us in a discussion of the High Seas Treaty. It's probably going to be 2 weeks because I won't be able to do it for that, but we will send out a notice on when we will resume that great decisions discussion. So for now, you know how it works. We're going to watch the video. You will be able to write your questions into the chat. And if you want to just ask it yourself, I can unmute you and you can do that as well. So we're going to let this go as informally as we can so that we can have a good discussion on a very, very important topic. So with that, I will ask Michelle to let's watch our Great Decisions video.
The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. We wrap things up today by focusing here in Week 8 on pandemic preparedness, a domestic and foreign policy challenge that we're mandated to confront given the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see from this timeline, pandemics are a part of world politics, a part of the natural evolution of history. They do not seem to arrive in any particular pattern, rhyme, or reason, each with its own sources and levels of human devastation. This is a global map of pandemics and diseases. The ones that you see now are either resurging or reemerging. In other words, they're not new. We've dealt with them in the past, and we're now dealing with them in the 21st century. When we add the newly emerging epidemics, pandemics, and diseases, the map is overwhelmed. This is a simple reality of modern world politics. We're dealing increasingly with global viruses, diseases, and even pandemics. Each nation state is prepared to handle diseases, viruses, and the like based upon its health security rating. And as you'll note from this graph, very large population centers, especially in Asia, such as China, India, the Philippines, Indonesia, among others, rate very low on the Global Health Security Index score, while wealthy nations, areas of East Asia, Western Europe, and North America, do very well. The United States, not surprisingly, is at the top of the Security Index rating. Having said that, the United States struggled mightily to deal with the coronavirus, COVID-19, which began in this country in 2020, overwhelmed by the sheer demand of such an unknown disease. It harks back to a century ago, when in Europe and the United States, we simply did not have the capacity to deal with a devastating disease.
Mass infection and epidemics are a threat to every city, to every nation. Scientific and medical work on a local scale are no longer enough.
This graph shows us the very rapid rise in the number of cases on a daily basis in the United States, which is in dark, and the European Union, which is indicated in gray. Europe was hit a few months before the United States, but as you'll note, from early March of 2020 until the early portion of April, cases in both Europe and the United States on average rose at relatively the same rate. Europe then experienced a dramatic decline in the number of cases through the middle of 2020, while the US rating stayed very, very high. The United States makes up about 1/20 of the world's population, yet we accounted for over 1/4 of all cases. In terms of deaths, the United States represented about 1/5 of all deaths associated with COVID-19. When it comes to politics and health security, clearly the United States government will be at the center of any graph. It oversees institutions responsible for health policy, but is made up of Democrats and Republicans. In other words, partisan politics is always a factor to be calculated into the equation. We would like to see a healthy balance between health policy on the one hand and partisan politics on the other, with the U.S. government being the arbiter. During a health emergency, in the ideal situation, health policy would outweigh partisan politics. During COVID-19, however, politics played a major role in the way that we responded to COVID-19. It was argued by many that a mask was a symbol of tyranny, that no government had the right to mandate the wearing of masks in public. There are times when I would like to show a cloth mask to our founding fathers. They understood what tyranny was. I seriously doubt they would equate a mask with tyranny. Some people went in the opposite direction. They encouraged the contraction of the coronavirus. College students held COVID parties where they were encouraged to congregate very closely, share a common environment, and then see who the first to contract COVID-19 would be. As we think about this from a political party line, very early on, by summer of 2020, when the vaccine became available, there was a stark difference between Democrats and Republicans. 83% of Democrats approved of the vaccine, which, by the way, occurred under a Republican administration, while less than half of Republicans believed that it was the right move to make. The two parties narrowed by the early fall of 2020 and then quickly returned to virtually the same place they started, 83% to 45% along party lines. When we ask people, are you going to get the virus vaccine? Are you going to get the newest booster? Overall, roughly half of Americans said they don't think that they needed it, and a significant number said they don't think the benefit of the vaccine is worth it. As it relates to party lines, Democrats had a much lower percentage of apprehension, while Republicans had an overwhelming concern over the vaccine boosters. When we ask another question, you haven't gotten the virus vaccine, is it because you're just too busy, you haven't had a chance? Now it's the Democrats that respond, a majority of them saying they're either too busy or have not had time to get the most recent booster. There are three main considerations that we'll think of today before looking at U.S. foreign policy options. We'll take a review of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll ask the question whether the United States should go it alone, use its energy, resources, and scientific discoveries to benefit its nationals, or should we cooperate through international organizations and institutions with other countries? And finally, pandemic preparedness. The coronavirus, COVID-19, is called COVID-19 because it was first identified in 2019. And I remember a U.S. senator saying, if COVID-19 is so bad, why didn't we hear of the first 18 COVIDs? That's an indication that politicians really did not have the knowledge and understanding about this pandemic that they would need to make public policy. Coronavirus is taken from the Latin for crown It is an upper respiratory infection that dates back over 10,000 years. COVID is not new. In fact, you find the coronavirus in roughly 30% of common colds. The problem is that it varies. Strains emerge that are more dangerous and more complex. COVID-19 simply happens to be the most deadly coronavirus variant. This graph shows us the number of deaths that occurred between early January and early May of 2020. You'll note the skyrocket beginning around the middle of March of that year. This represents the very same graph, but on a longer time scale. And what we witnessed was a give and take waves of the coronavirus, with deaths dropping off before they spiked in early 2021, dropping off again, spiking yet again, dropping off, and then spiking one more time before world deaths did finally decline, hopefully for the long-term future. We reached the 5 million death mark at the end of October of 2021, and by the end of 23, the death toll will surpass 7 million people. Overwhelmingly, as you can see from this graph, the Western Hemisphere has been affected more than Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Western Hemisphere makes up the Americas, North, South, Central, and the Caribbean. COVID is very much still with us. It's existed for 10,000 years. It'll exist for another 10,000, but COVID-19 remains a serious concern for us. In the United States, it is a top 5 cause of death, and only roughly 1 in 33 Americans have received the most recent COVID booster shot. We may be done with COVID, but COVID is not done with us. Should we cooperate or go it alone? Well, cooperation has been the aim of international organizations for centuries. The League of Nations was established in the aftermath of World War I. It created what is called the Health Organization. This is the result of a new challenge faced in the post-World War I era. Destruction was widespread, including to hospitals, medical facilities, the availability of potable and safe water, and refugees numbered into the millions. The Spanish flu hit the world shortly thereafter, leading to the creation of the Health Organization. It attempted principally and early on to prevent the spread from Poland of a number of viruses, including cholera, typhoid, and typhus. The track record of the Health Organization was pretty impressive. If we look at the overall report card of the League of Nations, we should divide the grades in 2, and we will have a basic minimum threshold for a passing grade. When it comes to issues of peace among nations, which is really what the League of Nations was designed to address, preventing yet another world war, the report card shows a failing grade. World War II essentially ended the League of Nations and that aspirational aim of avoiding catastrophic conflict. On issues such as health, social, and humanitarianism, however, the League of Nations was pretty impressive. Not only the Health Organization, but the Refugee Organization, as well as a number of social and economic institutions, including peacekeeping, were introduced by the League of Nations and held over and maintained by its successor. Just as World War I created the League of Nations, the much larger Second World War helped create the groundwork for the much larger United Nations. And the way to understand the United Nations is twofold. From an organizational standpoint, it is the League of Nations writ large. It has the basic same structure, but it was expanded dramatically. In terms of political thinking, however, the League of Nations was very liberal and idealistic. The United Nations was created from a classic realpolitik standpoint. Looking at the United Nations today, it is vast, it is global, a large number of principal organs on the left-hand side, subsidiary organs, funds, specialized agencies, programs, offices, departments, and institutions. At a minimum, the ones in blue shown here are designed to address social, economic, and humanitarian interest. In fact, we could probably expand that to include roughly 2/3 of all United Nations institutions. And while the UN has struggled greatly to prevent nations from going to war or from resolving their conflicts once the war begins, the UN has been very successful in saving lives and promoting social and humanitarian interest. In other words, the report card looks a lot like that of the old League of Nations. The World Health Organization was a holdover from the League. The HO became the WHO, established in 1948 in the very same offices in Geneva, Switzerland. Today it has 194 member states. It addresses issues of international public health with some 7,000 workers worldwide. No authority over nation states. The United Nations, like its predecessor, institutions that allow nations to help themselves through the rules, processes, and procedures of the organizations. These organizations are only as strong and as effective as nation states allow them to be. It issues alerts about new viruses, diseases, and pandemics, and fights diseases as well. It is essentially the global health nerve center of the world. The World Health Organization connects research institutions, hospitals, and government agencies and promotes the smooth transition of information, sharing of info, and cooperation to prevent diseases from spreading. Not surprisingly, most of the World Health Organization's attention is directed towards diseases like smallpox, polio, and Ebola. At the same time, it goes beyond the diseases, suggesting health diet regulations, nutrition and food security, as well as addressing substance abuse. And finally, the WHO confronts regional and global pandemics, such as COVID-19. The United States has many concerns as it relates to the World Health Organization. We believe it moved too slowly on COVID-19. Its guidelines were constantly changing. It seemed to be protecting China from criticism, and there's the need for greater accountability. All of these criticisms are valid. Let's turn our attention to China and its COVID responsibility. It waited 72, 96 hours after it discovered the leak of COVID-19 before warning the world. It delayed and continues to delay World Health Organization investigation. It delayed sharing the genome that was critical to finding the vaccine to respond, and it lobbied the World Health Organization to soften the statements it placed in its official documents. What is wholly and completely unacceptable is for the World Health Organization to balance the interest of the world with the sensitivities of Beijing.
The World Health Organization was concerned that if it was very critical of China and its lack of cooperation, lack of transparency, that could restrict further the World Health Organization's access to Wuhan and access and cooperation that the Chinese government was getting. So it was over the top in terms of its praise for China.
China has been very skillful at entering and penetrating a lot of international institutions that were really created as part of the liberal Western world order and based on liberal values such as transparency and openness, etc. But China, when it enters these institutions, although it subscribes to them, it signs all the agreements, it doesn't respect the rules.
One of the reasons WHO was subservient to China in the coronavirus pandemic was that a Chinese national had been Director General for 10 years before the current DG. And I think that's a mistake.
every member state in every international organization tries to get its way. To the degree that China has influence that it should not have within the WHO, that's a failure of diplomacy and of other countries to build coalitions to block China's efforts.
We now turn to pandemic preparedness. How can we best be ready for the next COVID-19 or the next global pandemic? There is a consensus among scientists. It begins with transparent communications about discoveries, alerts, and concerns. Its research must be evidence-based. It should develop a global plan of action and provide widespread free testing and vaccines for those who are interested in taking them. We certainly don't want there to be a modest economic barrier that could prevent people in poor countries from getting desperately needed vaccines. We should take politics out of the equation and restore trust in governments across the world, including here in the United States. Recent Pew Center research indicates that Americans are not very confident in their government's ability to respond to deadly diseases like COVID. When we ask Americans, do you believe your government is more divided than it was before COVID? The answer is yes, by 4-1. And when people are asked, do you think that the government can handle the outbreak of a disease given the weaknesses of the political system, only 2/3 of Americans say that it can. You'll note from this graph that largely Western societies are apprehensive and lack confidence in their governments and societies. This may be a result of the simple fact that they are all democracies, where people feel free to express their concerns and disdain for government policies. Public trust in U.S. government has plummeted. In the good old days of the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, some 73% of Americans had faith in their government. I cannot help but note that the severe decline in public support happened in the year that I was born, 1964, so perhaps I should take responsibility for that decline. Over the decades, it has continued to decline on average. In 2023, when this lecture is being recorded, only 16% of Americans, in other words, less than 1 in 7 of our compatriots, have faith in the U.S. government. So what are we to do about COVID-19? What are we to do about new pandemics as they emerge? Policies that we might want to consider include vaccinating the world as an investment and a safeguard for American health security, encouraging alerts about new variants of a disease, and of course reforming the World Health Organization. When it comes to vaccinating the world, we can see by this graph that very large populations, especially in Africa and the Middle East, have very low dosages of vaccines. And while we are aware of our ability to fully block and prevent people from Africa, from the danger zones, from entering the United States, there's very little that we can do when they travel to second countries, spread the disease, and then that disease travels to the United States. We cannot close off the entire world. We are better off and safer if people all over the globe have access to inexpensive, if not free, vaccines. 1 in 5 people in Africa are in what is considered the jump zone. That is the area where they're very close to making the decision to leave their continent and go elsewhere. Encouraging alerts is critical. We did this the wrong way during COVID. A new variant of COVID-19 was discovered by scientists in South Africa. That variant probably did not begin there, it was simply discovered there. And when their doctors and government announced to the world, we've discovered a new variant, we need to prepare for it, develop new vaccines for it, study it as a global society, it was labeled the South African variant, and flights into and out of South Africa were canceled. The country was effectively punished for alerting us of a new variant of COVID. And finally, we should think about reforming the World Health Organization. Reforming it begins with ending the consensus rule. With so many nation states with varying degrees of political interest and participation, we should not allow one nation to block legislation moving through the World Health Assembly. Rein in the regional offices, revise the assessment process, and perhaps have an independent advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization. And finally, it can be suggested we should have investigative teams along the lines of those used by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, which can go into countries and investigate what is happening. As noted earlier, the World Health Organization cannot be effective and receive full support if it is counterbalancing global interest with Chinese sensitivity. Any nation, including China, should be shamed when they do not fully cooperate in responding to global pandemics, diseases, and new variants. There was a time decades ago when China was shamed by the World Health Organization. A very different Director General was willing to put her credibility and her job on the line by saying to China, SARS is a problem that started in your country. You need to be more forthcoming, provide more information, and allow more investigation. This was a highly successful policy. The Chinese did allow the WHO team to go in, and SARS was largely mitigated because of the willingness of China to cooperate. That willingness was spurred on by shaming by the World Health Organization. We also, in this country, should change our messaging. This is a disease that started in China. China did mislead the World Health Organization, and the United States provides more than 10 times the money to the World Health Organization as the People's Republic of China, not to mention all of the voluntary funding that we provide to the WHO, the World Food Program, UNICEF, among many other international institutions that deal directly or indirectly with pandemics and their implications. Our policy is one to be proud of. China's is not. The world should hear that. Obviously, the message is not getting through because the world as a whole gives China higher marks for COVID than the United States. This is a self-inflicted wound. We are clearly not out of the woods, either with COVID or with new diseases. Even deadlier potential than COVID, the World Health Organization chief warns us. The trend line itself is not comforting. Since 2009 alone, a period of only 15 years, more than 900 new viruses have emerged and been identified. This does not even count the viruses that we've not yet located. It happens for a variety of reasons. It can be a wet market in China or deforestation in South America that releases unknown viruses upon the world. There's an old commercial that some of you may remember, Fram oil filters, where the mechanic would say, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. In other words, keep your oil clean by changing your Fram oil filter regularly. We can say the very same thing about pandemic preparedness. We can invest now, work with others, or the price we pay later will be significantly larger. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the masterclass for 2024. If you absolutely cannot wait to talk foreign policy, feel free to have your group leader or community social director reach out to me and we'll arrange a session, either by Zoom or in person. I'm very happy to visit communities across this great nation and talk foreign policy. Until next year, stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, I didn't expect that invitation, so if we want to invite him to speak directly to us, we can. But to lead our discussion today on this important topic, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. José de Arimatea da Cruz. He is professor of international relations and comparative politics at George Southern University. That's where he was practicing, a research associate of the Brazil Research Unit at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs in Washington. He's been a visiting professor at the Prague University of Economics and Business, Department of International and Diplomatic Studies, and he served as a visiting professor at the University of South Bohemia in the Czech Republic. He's also a former adjunct research professor at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Now, I have to say, I know Dr. da Cruz also because he's another president of a World Affairs Council or executive director in Savannah. And so he has, as you can imagine, a long and very distinguished bio. I won't waste any more time. Not that it's a waste, but I won't take up any more time reading his extensive bio. But let me tell you that we are in for a treat, and he has a lot of expertise to share with us. So, Dr. da Cruz, please take over.
Thanks so much, Joyce, for this kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, everything's fine.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with everybody. And especially to talk about such an important issue, and that is pandemic preparedness, which obviously I should argue that we should name that chapter Pandemic Unpreparedness, because we seem to forget previous experience and previous lessons from other pandemics that have impacted us worldwide. So it's an important topic, and I'm delighted to be here with everybody. I would, just by way of introduction, I would just say, pandemic is interesting because we treat a lot of things as national security. But one of the things that we have not treated as a national security is public health. Right? When we think about national security, we have a tendency to go back to, as it was discussed in the video, about the League of Nations, the United Nations formed to prevent future wars. So we're always concerned about another nation state attacking us, not some virus or something that's going to destroy us. But if you think about it, pandemic has been part of our, sort of historical evolution, going back to about 430 BC with the Peloponnesian War, as was discussed in the reading. And we've seen the impact that Ebola has had. And I want you to think about this. Imagine if you have a country anywhere around the world, but let's focus on the ones that are primarily in the tropic. And let's pick a number, 60 or 70% of your population may be sick. What's going to happen to your workforce? What's going to happen to your armed forces? And that's the problem that we have had. And I've been paying attention to this evolution of pandemic and the sort of the collateral damage that it does, not only to public health, but to other things, economic, social, and political, and national security. So until we really think about public health, just like climate change or whatever you want to call, as a national security issue, we're not going to put the resources, we're not going to put the effort into it. At the end of the video, there was an interesting comment that was made that worldwide we see China get high praise for its attempt to deal with the pandemic and everything else. Well, you also have to remember that China is one of the largest foreign direct investors in developing countries, which need the resource that China is willing to give them with one conditionality, and that is you have to break diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Otherwise, tell me what you need. So there's a lot of input. It's an interesting topic of discussion. Unfortunately, we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm glad that you have emphasized that we need to really stop and think that now public health and especially pandemics are national security issues. They can fell a country, they can fell a people. I mean, they can do as, I mean, it almost feels as if they can do as much damage as bombing, can. But I guess one of the first questions, because you're somebody who stepped back to look at this, have we learned lessons that will prepare us for the next go round? Because from what I'm hearing from this, and I think you agree, it's not if, but when we face this again, right?
That's correct. That's something that we have to be used to it. And that was stated at the end of the video as well. The COVID-19 is still with us. There's still people being infected by the disease. And unfortunately, we're still just treated as another common cold or another, I'll get it. And I don't know if you remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, nationwide, there were college campuses, hosting party to see who was going to get sick first and everything, and also people, unfortunately, thinking that, I don't have to take the vaccine because, it only took 6 weeks to develop. Well, how many vaccines have we taken in our lifetime that we don't question how long it took for them to develop, right? So to answer your question, yes, there will be another pandemic. It's not a matter of if, but when. Are we better prepared today? I think depends where you go. I think, some countries have taken the pandemic, COVID-19 experience to heart and have put into place into policies, procedure to address it. Other countries have not, unfortunately. And if you take a look, it's quite interesting to see this. Countries in which people have trust in their government institutions, and by government institutions, I mean the presidency, members of Congress, members of their parliament, they were able to deal with the pandemic much better than other countries in which had a much polarized society.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to keep that in mind, because you can still put the resources into place. But if people take the sort of attitude that this will not happen to me, or has not happened to me, therefore, or any member of my family, therefore we're immune, then we're going to have problems down the road. And that's the situation that we're in today. I think that the CDC is better prepared to deal with it. The World Health Organization is better prepared to deal with it. I think the Institute of Health Science is better prepared to deal with it. The lessons are in place, but we also have to remember that, as it was pointed out in the video, we should take politics out of the equation. But unfortunately, politics is an integral part when it comes to something like that.
Right. I mean, that's the key right there. I mean, I remember we all lived through this, right? And so right at the beginning, it was hard to know who to trust. It was hard to know, you had the president saying one thing or not saying anything. You had Dr. Fauci, you had other people saying different things. And so if you were just an average American, you're looking at this and you're confused. You don't know who to believe. I guess we aren't even past that yet.
No, we're not. We're not. And if you think about it too, we also have external actors, our near peer enemies, Russia, China, using malinformation, disinformation, misinformation to kind of create more confusion within society, for their own advantage, and to show, look at this country, wants to be the leader of the world, but cannot get its house together.
Right.
And that's important to think about that as well, that not only we're having sort of this political crisis, right? If the president's saying something and a member, Dr. Fauci, is saying something, who to trust or who to listen to, you also have external actors infiltrating the conversation and passing on misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. And the public, of course, not everybody's a scientist. Who am I going to trust? I don't know about you. I took the easy route. I say, I'm going to get vaccinated.
Yep. No, I was begging, where can I get vaccinated?
Right.
Yes.
That's my personal choice, which I would not say, Joyce, you better go get yours. Well, if you want to get it, get it. If you don't. But I think that's important to keep in mind.
But let's stop right there because at least the gentleman that's in the video, and maybe I misinterpreted, seemed to indicate that there really does need to be some universal standards and that perhaps people should be forced to get vaccinated. I mean, he's even talking about the United States perhaps going and vaccinating the world, right? I mean, how could we do that? I mean, but that's what he's talking about. And I get it because the one message that has been brought home to me through this, if my neighbor is sick, I'm going to get sick.
Yeah.
I need to make sure. So, I mean, that was a huge message. But I guess what I'm saying is, how can you just allow it to be, well, if you want to, if you, because you're getting sick is going to kill me.
Correct. Well, I'm gonna be sort of the devil advocate, right?
Okay, good,
Uh,
good.
Obviously, we live in a democratic society in which freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and other freedoms should be respected. And that's one of them. If for some reason you feel like I don't want to take this because I don't know what's going to be the physiological, pathological problems in the future, then I won't. Well, that's your problem. But then it's also my problem to make sure that if you're not vaccinated, you're not in a public place in which you could infect the population, right?
Yeah.
So we're caught in a catch-22. And again, think about the polarization this country is going through as we speak. And it was highlighted in the video as well when the pandemic started and last year, 2023. So it's complicated, you know, and to expect that the United States is going to vaccinate the world, it's obviously, kind of sort of naivete for us to assume that, because every nation state in the world is a sovereign nation. They're not going to want the United States to come and dictate what they should do. And then you also have to remember that countries around the world, in addition to have their tradition, values, they have their historical memory.
Yeah.
And when you think about Orange, agent, when you think about the Tuskegee research, people are going to think about that and say, what is the purpose of this vaccine and why is the United States doing here? So we always have to think about the sort of the duality that we're facing when we're trying to address this issue. Because yes, we should vaccinate the world, but then the world is also going to say, oh, hang on for a second. What is the purpose of this vaccine and what do you want to accomplish with it?
Yeah. So you're right. You have the political polarization, but you also have the historic distrust.
Correct.
And I remember the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg became, we took it upon ourselves to educate, to try to do enough forums to educate people about the vaccines and about the virus. We did so many Zoom webinars on this. In addition, we organized vaccine clinics. We worked with community or to have places. We went and brought the vaccines to people. But I can tell you in the Black community, especially among men, it was a hard sell. It was really
in the Hispanic community as well.
Yeah.
In the Hispanic community, as you mentioned earlier, I'm from Georgia. So the rural areas of Georgia were very reluctant to take the vaccine. And my daughter is a medical student, so she volunteered to give vaccines and everything else. And she was, telling us, Dad, they don't want to take the vaccine. And some family members are sick. And I say, Hannah, you have to think about the history, the sort of the institutional history, and people embrace that idea, some of those ideas, but I think, rather than tell people you should be vaccinated, I think they should do what your council did, which I applaud, and that is educate the population, not sugarcoat it, but educate the population on the issues, on the topic, and the consequences of it, and let them make their own decision. Because when you force somebody to do something, it's almost within our own inner self that when you force somebody to do something, they're going to push it back.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because nobody, they'll say, you're not my father. Who are you? That's the typical response. Who are you to tell me right? So rather than, I think, push somebody and force somebody, educate them. And I think that's what the World Affairs Councils of America would do a tremendous job educating the people and let them make their own decision. But at least they have legitimate information that they could make an educated decision rather than read something on TikTok or Facebook.
Yep.
And I think it's important.
Absolutely. You know, you've touched on so many things here, but I will tell you, it's this idea of building that foundation of trust before the emergency is important. It's one of the reasons why right now we've not abandoned our public health forums. We actually have started a public health initiative that we continually will hold forums and bring in experts so that when the next emergency comes, there are people who trust what we're bringing to them.
Correct. And it doesn't have to be another pandemic. You know, it could be issues related to heart disease. It could be issues related to obesity. Those are national security crises. You know, I see this every day at the Army War College when we discuss the fact that our recruiters are not meeting its target because most of the kids cannot pass the basic test. Wow. Because of obesity, the inability to finish their run on time. So that could create some tremendous, hardship for us down the road. Absolutely. How are we going to try to be, face China, Iran, Russia, and other non-state actor when we don't have the force capability or the force projection? And that's
It really is about. Let me do this because there's so much I could talk to you about this, but we do have someone who's offered a question. I want to get to our audience question. It says, are there specific policy reforms or investments that government should prioritize to enhance their preparedness for future pandemics? So if you were to say, let's say 3 things that governments ought to be doing right now, what would it be?
I think, and I'm going to borrow from the video because I agree with them. And the consensus rule. That's number 1, right? And again, if you think about the consensus rule, that's also a relic of the Cold War, right? You have the Security Council and you have 5 nations that can say, nope, nothing happens. It's the same thing within the World Health Organization, but that's a different institution that's dealing with pandemics and everything else. So I agree with what was mentioned and the consensus rules, okay? That idea to create sort of a virus detective, that's extremely important. And the CDC has folks like that here in Atlanta. It's called virus detective. When something happens within a community, they dispatch those individuals and they begin the process of investigating what caused, what led to this. So this is an idea that the World Health Organization could adopt it. Obviously, you run into the sovereignty issue, right? Why should I allow this individual to come here and look around? Is he here to discover what was the cause of this pandemic, or is he here as a spy, or here as a member of any governmental agency? So you run into those complications. And then I think, education is the key. Mm-hmm. Education is extremely important. I was in Kenya back in, I think it was 2000, when I was working in Kenya and Tanzania. And it was interesting because we're trying to address the issue of HIV/AIDS. And every village that I went to, there were posters talking about addressing the HIV/AIDS, what do you have to do to protect yourself. It was fantastic. And I read every one of them because it was in English. Mm-hmm. So I asked the director of the program, and I said, how many people in the village speak English as opposed to Swahili? And she goes, I have no idea. And I said, what do you mean you have no idea? You putting out a public health campaign and you have not talked to the people that's going to be impacted by it. So I said, how about if we find out if we have to put something in Swahili and something in English? And to make a long story short, the answer was, yes, we do. That's something that we have to keep in mind as well, that when we do public education, we educate the public, we have to keep in mind that there's going to be differences in language. There's going to be differences in socioeconomic status. There's going to be differences in religious belief. And we have to take that into that consideration, because to address a pandemic like this, one size fit all is not going to work.
Yeah.
There's a lot of disparity. Just to give you an example, when the pandemic hit the Americas, it hit in two places to begin with, Brazil and Chile. In Brazil, it was an individual that was in Italy visiting families. And then he came to Brazil. He returned to Brazil. He's a Brazilian citizen. He returned to Brazil, and then he began to develop the symptoms. Well, as soon as they found out that was COVID, he isolated. That's an individual who had the means, and he lived in a big house that had more than one room, so he could quarantine. The individual in Chile was in Bariloche, Argentina, skiing. So he comes back, same thing. He had the house had a nice apartment, so he could lock himself in a room. But imagine when you're dealing with people in shanty towns.
Oh, yes. Yes.
They have a family, where the father, the mother, and the grandmother, and the great-grandmother, they're all together. How are you going to isolate people? You can't. So the best thing to do is, how can we educate people in those circumstances to deal as best as they can with the problem? And that is important to keep in mind.
Let's talk about a sticky wicket here. And that is shut down. I mean, to me, to be honest, it made sense. Until we know what we're dealing with, let's put everything on hold. Let's keep people from going to work. Let's keep people at home. We have to deal with the economic repercussions. But first, to me, saving lives, until we get this. But that was one of the biggest issues that, people went ballistic over being told they can't go out, that they can't go to work. So, talk about that. As you're looking at it, especially from the issue of protecting our homeland, what are your thoughts?
Well, it boils down to that issue again, individual freedoms, right? There are people that are going to, no matter what you tell them, they're going to believe that the mass tyranny, the big government is telling what to do. I'm not going to do it. On the other hand, when they get sick and they don't have the resources, government is going to have to take care of them. Right. Yep. So you always run into that issue. So I agree with you 100%. I always think about, like, if you wake up tomorrow morning and you go, oh my gosh, I'm dizzy. You don't say, you know what, I'm going to go on. What do? You go to a doctor, right? Because you want to find out, is this something serious or what? And I think that's something that we should have done by educating the public, is to make sure that this is not how you're going to live the rest of your life. This is until we get this under control. But again, given the polarization in our society, and given the fact that, different politicians were saying different things, it creates a lot of confusion. So when something like this happens, you have to make sure that everyone in the team is on the message.
Yes.
You can't be having the director of the health institute saying A and somebody else saying B, because then it creates more confusion, and then people begin to pick their favorite. Who do I choose to listen to? And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Was the lockdown necessary? I think it was. But once you find out what's going on, how you can control, begin to educate the people and slowly open up. because I had left the Czech Republic before they did this. I was in the Czech Republic, and Michelle may remember that as well. I was in the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic, when the pandemic started, they took very proactive actions. And then they decided that they're going to celebrate, and over Charles Bridge, they had a huge table with food, wine, and invited everybody. And if you are downtown Prague, there are several universities.
Yes.
Charles University, the School of Economics where I teach. So everybody went to the bridge to celebrate the fact that COVID had not arrived in Prague and the Czech Republic. The week after, you begin to see the spike in COVID-19 in Prague and the Czech Republic, and then the government was forced to shut down. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, that we state that whatever message we develop during crisis, we stay focused, we all stay the same. You can't be saying A and somebody else saying B, because it creates a lot of confusion, and then the public gets confused as well.
Absolutely, absolutely confused. And I will tell you, I think the whole thing of we've got to figure out a way to reestablish public trust in American institutions. And I wanted to ask, from the FDA to wherever, but I also wanted to ask you, what about the World Health Organization? How much trust does it enjoy around the world?
Well, I'm going to speak from the Americans' perspective, right? The Central South, a lot, and also from African countries, because it is the organization that come to the rescue, right? But it's beginning to be very politicized by the Chinese government, as was mentioned. So when that happens, then people begin to question whether this organization is for the public good or for the good of a nation that would like to replace the United States as the sole superpower. And that becomes complicated. So I'm a strong believer, and this is my own personal opinion, that the World Health Organization needs to take a strong stand against China and really let them know that if they have done something wrong, say it. You have done something wrong. Now, work together, and let's try to solve this rather than sugarcoat it, as was mentioned in the video, and it has been established by several governments around the world, that the Chinese government is responsible for the virus, and yet for hours, for weeks, and for months has not released any data to this date on where it started, what led to it. So I think that creates a lot of discredit the organization that's supposed to be the beacon of help for public health.
Absolutely. So just to step back and assess to what we have been talking about and what we've concluded, we think we've learned some lessons. We think that we know trust is key, and that's what we ought to be working on right now. WHO, the American institutions, how can we make sure people trust what's being said? We, I think, agree, or that you've got to take some drastic measures when you get something that you don't understand. Because look, when we first started this virus, they were telling us not to wear masks. I remember doing a forum like this, a webinar where the doctor was saying, no, don't wear a mask because they're not effective anyway. That was reversed. So a lot of what we were saying at the beginning got changed completely. So again, when you don't know what you're dealing with, there needs to be drastic efforts to shut it down. So we've learned that, I think, or at least some of us have learned that. But
well, I hope so. And this is one of those situations, right? That I'm a strong believer in certain things. But if you give me enough information to change my mind, I'll change my mind. And I think that's that we should have done, and say, Yes, we said don't wear masks because we didn't understand the severity and the consequences of this virus. Now that we're coming to see the body bags, and let's do something. And I think that was sort of the missing opportunity for us to really say the reason why we're saying wear masks now is because A, B, C, or D. And I think that was a poor communication on the part of political officials and also public health officials during that time.
And I'll say one other thing, that we do mandate some things for public health. I mean, I had to get a measles shot. I had to get the kids have to get those initial boosters so we do, if they're going to go to school, right?
Correct.
So again, I think you touched on this, that, okay, let's say you don't want to do the vaccine. That's your right. But then you can't go to the movie theater and you can't, then you must be restricted in some areas. How do you think that would sit?
Well, I don't think that would sit, given the political climate that we're in right now. If you take a look at every political poll, the nation is divided, unfortunately, because that's not what the United States is all about. We have gone to tougher times, and we stick together, we come together, and we resolve our differences, and we rise to the occasion. This has been very complicated, so I think to do something like that, there will be a backlash against whoever's in power that would cause more detrimental to solving the issue than to come to a sort of a peaceful resolution. I really think so.
So that here's where we are then. We are, if we stick to what you're saying there, which I understand, I'm not challenging it, but it really means that even those of us who decide we're going to be vaccinated and we're still going to be exposed because of those actions. Those people still are going to be a threat.
Well, and I think we are at this right now. I think we are. But again, I always tell people that I'm fully vaccinated. I took the 6 shots.
Right.
Whatever's available, I'm taking. Because I want to make sure that if I do get infected, the severity or the consequences of it is not going to be similar to somebody who is not vaccinated.
Correct. Yes.
We can't, even when somebody says, why should I take the vaccine if I'm going to get it? Well, we do this all the time. You take medicine, but you can still have a heart attack.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. So that's the nature. This is what it means to be alive. You wake up in the morning and you could take all necessary precautions, avoid risk, but you're still going to face some kind of risk in your life. But if you can minimize that risk, do it. And that's why it's important to take the vaccine, because if you get the virus, then the consequences of it is going to be a lot less than what would be if somebody is not vaccinated.
Absolutely. Well, one final question, and I guess this is going to be a tough one. Do you see anything out there on the horizon that we need to worry about? What's next?
Oh, I do. I'm very concerned about climate change and what's going to do to the world maybe in 2 decades or 3 decades. You see the Arctic region melting. You see new sea routes being developed. You begin to see the Chinese government, the Russian government beginning to come into that region. It is one of the most urbanized region of the world as the permafrost begin to melt. So you're going to see a lot of things that we didn't know, virus, bacteria that have been sort of, for lack of a better word, is sleeping because of the region and its condition. Now with this influx of people, so that concerns me.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be really interesting to see in the years to come. Climate change it's going to be, it's something that we don't want to talk about it. We have a tendency to kind of push to the side, but I think, the summers are getting a little bit hotter than usual. And I worry about folks in certain communities, the elderly, people who have some kind of disease, that if they go out and body temperature rises and they're unable to find a comfortable place to rest or drink enough water. So those are the things that I've been working on at the War College right now. And we're kind of putting our heads together and thinking, what's the world going to look like, 10, 20, 40, 30 years from now? Which, when you think about decades, you go like, such a long time. And then you take a nap and here you are in 2025 almost. I was talking to my wife a couple of days ago, and I said, I can't wait to see next month the Christmas tree out at Walmart. It's something that I think those are the major issues. We're still going to deal with terrorism, transnational organized crime, and other things. But I think the climate change and the environmental security issues are going to be a major topic discussion.
Well, you raised an important point that it's not just the flooding and the violent weather and all of that with climate change, but it's unleashing these new viruses that we're not prepared for. So,
yeah, and that's what concerns me in terms of the future pandemics.
Yeah.
It's something that we may not know completely and may not be able to dissect its genome, and so that kind of concerns me.
Well, I'm going to leave on a happy note then. I know I said that was my last question, but this is really the last question. What about AI? Can AI help us with this?
I think it can. But AI, just like everything else, is garbage in, garbage out, right? And we have to remember that, you have to have good data in order to get good output. Yeah. If we're putting junk into AI, you're going to get junk on the outside, just like if you're creating any kind of program, a computer program, so that's important to keep that in mind. So we have to have good information. And that's why you have countries around the world that have a competitive edge over us, because, we live in a democracy. So when somebody says, well, stand in front of this and take a picture, I always ask them, why the hell you want to take my picture? What's this picture? Where's it going to go? But in certain countries, you just have to stand up. So China has an abundance of data, just like Russia, that they can input into a system and get a better output. On the other hand, we're sort of behind the 8 ball. And so I worry about that kind of stuff. So that's important.
Especially since all the misinformation that's out there, because the AI consumes the information and misinformation.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. And it's whatever you wanted to put into it. So, but I think it's going to be, there are scientists using right now, they're making discoveries that would take decades in matters of months, so that's a positive thing. But we also have to think about the fact that, garbage in, garbage out.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. de Cruz, I want to thank you so much for taking time to share your insights and to let us know what we need to worry about. But
Thank you.
Applause goes up. I am heartened to know that we have learned some lessons, at least from what we've been through. And we all people who are responsible are joining hands to try to make sure we at least know who we can trust if this should happen or when this should happen again.
No, absolutely. And I think this is great that we have, some folks joining us to make sure that we make great decisions rather than be fooled by the mild disinformation, misinformation. So this is fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.